The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift prisoner compound on Okinawa as Lieutenant James Morrison walked between the rows of canvas tents, his boots crunching softly on the coral dust that seemed to coat everything on this blood-soaked island. It was June 15, 1945, 3 weeks after the official end of the most brutal Pacific campaign the Americans had yet fought. The air still carried the acrid smell of burnt sulfur and death, mixed now with the salt breeze from the East China Sea. Morrison carried a wooden crate under his arm, its contents carefully arranged by the mess sergeant that morning. Fresh apples from California, soft white bread baked in the field kitchens, and small cartons of milk that had arrived on the morning supply ship from Pearl Harbor. Behind the barbed wire perimeter, 63 Japanese prisoners sat in rigid formation, their backs straight despite their wounds and exhaustion. Most wore the tattered remnants of Imperial Army uniforms, khaki cotton, bleached nearly white by sun and salt water, fabric torn by shrapnel and stained with mud from the caves of Shuri Castle, where they had made their last stand. Their faces were gaunt, cheekbones prominent beneath sun-darkened skin, but their eyes remained alert, watching Morrison's approach with a mixture of wariness and confusion. For these men, surrender itself had been an act that defied everything they had been taught about honor and duty to the emperor. Now, they awaited execution, or torture, or some fate worse than the honorable death they had been denied on the battlefield. The contrast between captor and captive could not have been more stark. Morrison, like most American servicemen in the Pacific, was well-fed, his olive-drab uniform clean and properly fitted, his equipment functional and abundant. Behind him, the American compound bustled with activity. Jeeps hauling supplies, soldiers writing letters home on real paper with real pencils, medics treating wounded with actual morphine and sulfa drugs. The Americans moved with the casual confidence of men who knew that somewhere behind them stretched an unbroken supply line reaching back across thousands of miles of ocean to factories in Detroit and farms in Iowa, to a homeland that could produce Liberty ships faster than the enemy could sink them and B-29s in numbers that darkened the sky. This abundance was no accident, but the product of an industrial civilization that had transformed itself into the greatest war machine in human history. By June 1945, American factories were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes and 1 ship every day. The logistics network that supplied American forces in the Pacific moved more tonnage across greater distances than any military force in history. Yet, for the Japanese prisoners sitting in that coral dust compound, this reality was incomprehensible. They had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, lacking the spiritual strength that came from devotion to the emperor and the Bushido Code. They had been told that American soldiers were cowards who would flee when faced. With the pure fighting spirit of the Yamato Damashi, the Bibiri Cham Setanoendain Tuai Teacher. Propaganda had painted Americans as materialistic consumers who lacked the spiritual depth to make real sacrifices for their cause. Japanese military training emphasized that victory would come through superior fighting spirit, through acceptance of death, through the willingness to endure hardship that weak Western minds could never comprehend. The reality of Japanese military life reflected this philosophy. Soldiers survived on handfuls of rice, wore uniforms until they fell apart, and were expected to find strength through spiritual discipline rather than material comfort. Many of the prisoners had not eaten a full meal in weeks. Their last rations had been distributed in April, and since then, they had survived on whatever they could forage from the bombed landscape of Okinawa. As Morrison approached the wire, he could see the prisoners' faces more clearly. There was Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, a career soldier who had fought in Manchuria and the Philippines, his left arm bound with strips of cloth torn from his own uniform. Beside him sat Private Hiroshi Tanaka, barely 19 years old, who had arrived on Okinawa just 3 months earlier as part of the desperate reinforcements rushed to defend the island. Tanaka's diary, discovered after his capture, recorded his growing disillusionment as the promised Japanese victory failed to materialize. June 5th. The American planes come every day now. We have no food. Sergeant says the Navy will send ships, but I have seen no ships except American ones. The American approach to prisoners of war reflected fundamental differences in how the two cultures viewed human dignity and military necessity. Where Japanese military doctrine treated surrender as the ultimate shame, American military regulations, grounded in both Christian humanitarian principles and adherence to international law, required decent treatment of captured enemies. This was not merely policy, but reflected deeper cultural values about the worth of individual human life and the possibility of redemption. The Geneva Conventions were not abstract legal documents to American commanders but practical guides for maintaining the moral authority that justified their cause. Morrison had read the intelligence reports about Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners, the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the medical experiments conducted by Unit 731. He knew that many of his own men expected him to return the brutality in kind. Yet standing before these defeated soldiers, he saw not monsters but human beings who had been caught up in a system that had taught them to value death above life and obedience above conscience. The white bread and fruit he carried represented more than mere food. They were symbols of a different way of thinking about what it meant to be human in wartime. The bread itself told a story of American abundance that the Japanese prisoners could barely comprehend. This was not the hard black bread of European armies or the rice balls that had sustained Japanese forces, but soft white bread made from wheat grown on the Great Plains, milled in Kansas City, and shipped across the Pacific in refrigerated holds. Each loaf represented an industrial and agricultural system so productive that it could afford to feed its soldiers better than most civilians ate in peacetime. The apples had been picked in orchards that stretched across valleys in Washington state, sorted and packed by workers who earned wages that allowed them to buy cars and houses, then transported in refrigerated rail cars across a continent where the lights stayed on and the factories never stopped. For Private Tanaka, the moment when Morrison opened the crate would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. In his post-war memoir, published in Tokyo in 1963, he wrote, "I had prepared myself for death, for torture, for any punishment the Americans might devise. I had dishonored my family by allowing myself to be captured, and I expected to pay the ultimate price. When the American officer approached our group, I closed my eyes and waited for the blow. Instead, I heard the sound of paper rustling. When I opened my eyes, he was placing food before us, not scraps or garbage, but fresh bread that was whiter and softer than anything I had eaten even before the war. There were apples, red and perfect, without a single blemish, and milk in small cartons with English writing I could not read." The silence that fell over the prisoner compound was profound. These were men who had been trained never to show emotion, never to display weakness before an enemy. Yet faced with this unexpected kindness, many struggled to maintain their composure. Sergeant Yamamoto later described the moment in interviews with American interrogators. "In China, we learned that prisoners were a burden to be eliminated quickly. In the Philippines, we saw captured Americans worked until they died. This was the natural order. The strong dominated the weak. Victors destroyed the defeated. But here was something we had never seen. An enemy who fed his prisoners better than we fed ourselves." The psychological impact of this simple act reverberated far beyond the immediate moment. For soldiers raised in a culture that emphasized scarcity, sacrifice, and spiritual strength through material deprivation, the casual abundance displayed by their captors challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of power and civilization. How could a nation of soft, materialistic consumers produce an army that had swept across the Pacific, island by island, with such overwhelming force? How could soldiers who ate fresh bread and fruit fight with such determination and skill? Morrison watched as the prisoners slowly, tentatively, began to eat. Their hunger was evident in the way they handled the food, carefully, reverently, as if afraid it might disappear. Many had not tasted fresh fruit in months. The apples were crisp and sweet, a reminder of abundance and normalcy that seemed to belong to another world. Some of the younger prisoners wept silently as they ate, overwhelmed by the unexpected mercy they had been shown. Others maintained their stoic expressions. But Morrison could see the confusion in their eyes as they tried to reconcile this reality with everything they had been taught about American character and intentions. The bread became, in those moments, more than sustenance. It was a symbol of everything the Japanese war machine had failed to provide for its own people. While American soldiers ate fresh bread baked in field kitchens, Japanese civilians in Tokyo and Osaka were grinding acorns into flour to make bitter loaves that barely sustained life. While American farmers continued to tend vast wheat fields protected by two oceans, Japanese farmers had been conscripted into military service, leaving rice paddies untended and harvests to rot. The simple act of sharing food revealed the fundamental unsustainability of the Japanese war effort, a nation fighting beyond its means against an enemy whose industrial capacity seemed limitless. Intelligence. Officers who interviewed the prisoners in the following days noted a common theme in their testimonies: shock at American material abundance, followed by a growing understanding of why their own cause had been doomed from the beginning. Corporal Kenji Sato, captured during the final assault on Shuri Castle, told his interrogators, "We were told that Americans were cowards who would run when faced with real soldiers. We were told they were weak because they lived comfortable lives. But how can a nation that feeds its prisoners fresh fruit and white bread be weak? How can soldiers who carry so much food and ammunition and medical supplies be soft? We were fighting ghosts. We thought we were fighting the Americans we had been told about, but those Americans never existed." The transformation in the prisoners' understanding of their situation was gradual, but profound. Day by day, as they were fed regular meals, treated for their wounds by American medics, and allowed to write letters to families they had assumed they would never see again, their worldview shifted. The American soldiers guarding them were not the demons of propaganda, but young men not unlike themselves, homesick, weary of war, looking forward to peace. Many spoke of sweethearts back home, of plans to return to college or start businesses when the fighting ended. They showed photographs of families, of farms and cities and high school graduations, revealing a civilization built on individual aspiration rather than collective sacrifice to an emperor god. For Sergeant Yamamoto, the revelation came gradually as he observed the casual interaction between American soldiers and their officers. In the Imperial Army, discipline was maintained through brutality and absolute hierarchy. Soldiers expected to be beaten for minor infractions, and officers maintained their authority through fear. Yet here he observed American sergeants speaking frankly with lieutenants, enlisted men making suggestions to their superiors, a culture of cooperation rather than terror. The effectiveness of American military organization began to make sense when viewed as the product of a society where individual worth was recognized and protected rather than crushed. The medical care provided to the prisoners further challenged their preconceptions about American character. Japanese military doctrine treated wounded soldiers as burdens who had failed in their duty by allowing themselves to be harmed. Medical care was minimal, morphine was reserved for officers, and soldiers were expected to endure pain as a test of their spiritual strength. American medics, by contrast, treated Japanese prisoners with the same care they provided to their own wounded. Sulfa drugs prevented infection, morphine eased pain, and surgical procedures saved limbs that would have been amputated or left to fester under Japanese military medicine. Private Tanaka's infected shrapnel wound, which had been slowly killing him since the battle for Shuri, was cleaned and treated by an American Navy corpsman who worked with the same careful attention he would have given to a wounded Marine. In his memoir, Tanaka wrote, "The corpsman was young, perhaps my own age, with gentle hands and a kind face. He spoke no Japanese, but his actions communicated more than words. He cleaned my wound carefully, applied medicine that stopped the burning pain, and bandaged it with clean white cloth. I had been taught that Americans were barbarians who would torture prisoners, but here was one who treated me with more care than I had ever received from my own officers." As weeks passed and the reality of American abundance became undeniable, many of the prisoners began to question not just their military situation, but the entire ideological foundation of the war they had been fighting. The emperor's divinity, the superiority of Japanese civilization, the inevitability of victory through spiritual strength. All of these beliefs crumbled in the face of evidence that suggested a different truth. The Americans who guarded them were neither gods nor demons, but human beings who happened to come from a society that had organized itself more effectively for both peace and war. Letters that prisoners were allowed to send home, heavily censored but still carrying basic information about their survival and treatment, began to have an impact in Japan itself. Families who had been told their sons had died honorably in battle learned instead that they were alive and well in American custody. The contrast between the propaganda that painted Americans as brutal savages and the reality described in these letters created cognitive dissonance that rippled through Japanese society. If the Americans were treating prisoners well, what did that say about the claims of Japanese moral superiority? Food continued to be the most powerful symbol of the cultural divide between captor and captive. American soldiers casually discarded half-eaten meals that contained more protein than many prisoners had consumed in weeks. K-rations, complained about constantly by American troops as monotonous and unpalatable, seemed like luxury items to men accustomed to subsisting on rice and pickled vegetables. The simple act of opening a can of peaches, a routine occurrence for American soldiers, became a marvel of technology and abundance, too. Prisoners who had rarely seen canned fruit, even in peacetime. Morrison began to understand that he was witnessing something more significant than the simple feeding of prisoners. Each meal became a lesson in the fundamental differences between the societies that had produced these two armies. American abundance was not merely material, but reflected deeper values about human worth and potential. A civilization that could afford to feed its enemies well was one that viewed human life as inherently valuable, regardless of nationality or ideology. This was not weakness, but strength, the confidence of a people who believed their way of life was worth defending and sharing. The impact on Japanese morale extended far beyond the prison compound. As word spread through whatever remained of Japanese military communications about the treatment of prisoners, some soldiers began to consider surrender as a viable option. The traditional preference for death over capture began to erode as stories circulated about Americans who fed their prisoners fresh fruit and treated their wounds with advanced medicine. For a military system built on the absolute fear of capture, this represented a fundamental challenge to discipline and fighting effectiveness. By August 1945, as news of atomic bombings reached the prisoners through carefully controlled American broadcasts, many had already begun to accept the inevitability of Japanese defeat. The bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki were merely the final demonstration of the technological and industrial superiority they had already witnessed in their daily interactions with American forces. The same civilization that could mass-produce white bread and fresh fruit across thousands of miles of ocean could also harness the power of the atom for warfare. The emperor's surrender announcement, when it finally came, found many of the Okinawa prisoners psychologically prepared for the end of the war. Their transformation from fanatical soldiers ready to die for the emperor to men who understood the reality of their situation had been gradual but complete. The white bread and fresh fruit had been more effective than any propaganda in demonstrating the futility of continued resistance and the possibility of a different kind of future. In the months that followed the surrender, as repatriation began and prisoners prepared to return to a defeated Japan, many carried with them a transformed understanding of the world and their place in it. The America they returned to describe to their families and friends was not the demonic enemy of wartime propaganda, but a complex civilization capable of both tremendous destructive power and unexpected mercy. The bread they had been given became a symbol not just of material abundance, but of a different way of thinking about human relationships and the purpose of national power. For Lieutenant Morrison, the experience of feeding Japanese prisoners fresh bread and fruit remained one of his most vivid memories of the war. In letters to his wife back in Ohio, he wrote, "These men were prepared to die for their emperor, convinced that we were savages who would torture and kill them. Instead, we gave them the same food our own soldiers eat, treated their wounds, and showed them that our fight was with their government, not with them as human beings. I think we won something more important than a military victory when we opened those crates of food. We proved to ourselves and to them that we really are fighting for the values we claim to represent." The symbolic power of that white bread extended far beyond the immediate moment of its consumption. In the post-war reconstruction of Japan, American food aid would play a crucial role in preventing famine and rebuilding society. The same abundant agricultural system that had fed American soldiers throughout the Pacific War would help sustain the Japanese people through the difficult years of occupation and recovery. The bread that had once been a symbol of American military superiority became a symbol of American humanitarian commitment to former enemies. The transformation of Japanese prisoners on Okinawa reflected broader themes about the nature of ideology, propaganda, and human adaptability in warfare. Men who had been taught to view their enemies as subhuman monsters discovered instead fellow human beings who showed them unexpected kindness. The power of simple human decency to transcend national and cultural boundaries proved stronger than years of indoctrination and military training. In sharing their food, American soldiers had shared something more valuable, a demonstration of the values they were fighting to preserve and extend. As the last of the prisoners prepared to board repatriation ships in late 1945, many carried with them small mementos of their captivity. A piece of paper from an American K-ration box, a photograph given by a guard, a letter from an American soldier's family that had been shared with them. But more importantly, they carried memories of an encounter with abundance and mercy that had challenged everything they thought they knew about their enemies and themselves. The white bread and fresh fruit had nourished more than their bodies. It had planted seeds of understanding that would grow in the decades of peace to come. The morning Lieutenant Morrison walked between those canvas tents carrying his wooden crate had marked more than just another day in a prisoner of war camp. It had been a moment when two civilizations met, not on the battlefield but across a simple meal, when abundance met scarcity, when mercy encountered desperation. In that meeting, something fundamental had shifted. Not just in the understanding of those particular prisoners, but in the larger narrative of what it meant to be human in the midst of the most destructive war in history. The bread had been consumed, the fruit eaten, but the lesson lingered, that even in war, there remained possibilities for dignity, for kindness, and for the recognition of shared humanity that no amount of propaganda could entirely destroy.